Hello, and welcome to episode one in a series of podcasts that we're going to be doing with Beam Dynamics. And David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Happy to be here and chat.
So today we're going to delve into a little unknown thing called CRA, which is the Cybersecurity Resilience Act. Now, before we start, because a lot of people don't know what on earth this is, let alone why it's relevant for our industry, would you mind giving us a little bit of a high-level overview as to why we're having this chat in the first place?
Certainly. So the CRA is a new EU regulation that's going to affect how devices that have software or firmware embedded in them need to be communicated with updates to customers, which is going to be a big challenge for manufacturers. But taking a step back, I actually want to talk about how I stumbled upon this because it was kind of new to me, and the reason why I really thought this is something that our industry needs to start talking about. So I was at IBC a couple months ago and was talking to vendors and manufacturers about asset management, how they track firmware and software updates and licensing, because that's kind of what our platform is built for. And through those conversations, we heard a number of manufacturers start to ask about CRA, what that's going to mean for them, if we had any ways to help them manage that. And I really didn't understand or know what the CRA was. And so chatted with a few more manufacturers. A lot of them also had very little information, how that was going to affect them. And so I decided, why don't I start to look into this and research what this is going to be. And so on a couple hour flight from Amsterdam back to the US, I opened up the large legal document that had been put out by the EU on the CRA, what it was, who it was going to affect, and spent several hours going through this document and just saw that this was going to be a huge challenge and problem for our industry, that from those initial discussions, no one really seemed to have a clear understanding of what it was going to be, how it was going to affect them, and how they were going to need to adapt and update their operations to really manage and support these new mandates that were going into effect. And so through the last couple months, started talking to a few more people, continue to hear no one really knew what was going on, what they needed to do, what tools were out there. And so that's essentially why we wanted to start this, is to start having these types of conversations and helping the industry ultimately find a path through this that allows them to stay compliant without costing them a ton of financial resources to implement that, as well as making sure that they don't have any fines associated with being non-compliant.
And that's the scary thing, right? First of all, not many people knew about it. And the second thing is, how much is this going to cost me? And of course, the third rather scary thing is when this is meant to actually come into, when this is meant to happen, which is 2027, which is actually next year. So everything that's being manufactured right now is probably almost a bit too late, and there's a lot of stuff which is going to need to be done retrospectively. So you've explained a little bit of it. Can you explain it in really simplistic terms, what exactly this is going to mean for us and why we actually need to take note of it really and take it seriously?
Certainly. So Cybersecurity Resilience Act, right? So cybersecurity. So what this is ultimately intended for is to protect from cyber threats. As more hardware is having components of software embedded within it, whether that's directly from that manufacturer's devices or through OEM third parties, right? The EU wants to ensure that all of these devices are protected. That's everything from home thermostats, right? You don't want someone coming in and infiltrating, a home thermostat network and getting through.
Yep.
And that hardware is embedded with software. So ultimately, this is to protect those types of devices. While obviously there's broad-reaching applications like smart home thermostats, it also is going to apply heavily to broadcast technology. And so all of our devices and hardware from manufacturers are also containing subcomponents from other OEMs. And so all of those need to have a way to track all the versions, any credible security threats, as well as having a way to communicate that throughout the entire manufacturing process. So while one vendor may deliver your final product, that final product could have software in it from that vendor, but there's also potentially 10, 20, hundreds of subcomponents from other manufacturers that also have software or firmware embedded on chips. All of that has to be communicated through the original OEM up to the final vendor back to the customer. And so this is going to be a huge, huge challenge, not just staying on top of it, but also in does that information get communicated to an end user when they might own a device, your home thermostat or your server from this manufacturer has something that is potentially a candidate for a cybersecurity threat that you need to address.
It's anything that basically is attached to a network, which is just a whole minefield. I mean, it's literally the end-to-end of our entire world these days. So it affects everybody. It affects us, the user, as well as, from our point of view, people in the media and entertainment industry. And it seems to be that we're starting to know about it. I know that Avix has done some things from the AV point of view, but I think the hardcore broadcast is yet to really understand the real impact this is actually going to have on them.
Correct.
So why did you think the EU felt that there was a law that was necessary to bring in? To me, it's a little bit like GDPR, and we all had to go through that process. So to me, I think it's another process very, very similar to that. And we are going to have to conform. And even though it's in the EU, anybody who sells to the EU also has to conform. So unlike GDPR, this is actually global.
Correct. And it's a requirement now to get your CE certification. So if you want to have that CE certification, which products obviously have to have in order to be sold in certain countries, this is now going to be a requirement that you have to adhere and validate that in order to get that CE approval. So there's a wide-ranging, impact, but I think ultimately the reason behind it is ultimately to protect from widespread cybersecurity threats across, a country or a region. And they see that one of those opportunities is to go through these types of devices. And so the law is really set to protect us from a widespread cyber threat, providing a better data flow for fixing those potential issues, both from a manufacturer as well as to the end customer themselves, to know that they could be affected by one of these potential risks that needs to be fixed. So there's good rationale behind it, but like GDPR, the implementation is going to be long and fuzzy in some cases, and it's sometimes difficult to understand. And I think that's that's the area that we're trying to to make sense of that for our industry, and how can we really come together to solve this in a simplified way.
So as Beam, one of your USPs is that you talk to an awful lot of manufacturers and you manage the digital intelligence and the assets for everything, for the lifespan, OPEX versus CAPEX, you name it. You've really got that sewn up. But the CRA does cover a really wide gambit of types of products. So the media and entertainment industry, it's not just cameras and lenses and things like that. It's the whole thing, especially now we are leaning a lot more to the IP world as well. So how do you feel that our technology really fits into the CRA picture? And we may as well do a little bit of a sales pitch for Beam while we're at it.
Yeah, well, and that's what we're trying to figure out at Beam, is what do we need to continue innovating and developing to solve this problem in a simple way, in a very cost-effective way for our customers or potential customers. So we're still discovering ourselves, but I think the difference between our industry and some of the other industries this may impact is that broadcast in general relies on hundreds of different manufacturers, hundreds of or thousands of different devices. Each of those has their own software versions, firmware versions, and relationships to other systems, right? We have to understand those relationships.
That's everything, right?
So in a more traditional environment where you've deployed IT, right? You may be at a large corporation, financial services firm, let's say. Yes, you have servers, but they're all the same manufacturer. They're all the same brand. Communication's a lot easier when you've got just a few things, a few vendors to manage. The broadcast world is not that way. If you've ever been on set, been in a control room, been in a server room, there is stuff everywhere. There's lots of different vendors represented. There's different ages of this. And at Beam, we saw early on, customers didn't really have a good way, broadcasters, to manage the devices, to understand what was embedded within them, to track those updates. So we're looking at extending our functionality to deliver this, but that's essentially why we're concerned about our industry, because there's so many devices and manufacturers involved in these environments. The ability and the capability for any single team to stay on top of this is going to be an incredibly cumbersome and arduous task that we really are not prepped for, because of the nature of how we actually deploy broadcast, right? It's very rare that you've got one manufacturer that represents everything. It's hundreds, and that means hundreds of places to track and monitor this information.
And they don't necessarily all talk nicely to each other either. Collaboration and interoperability has been talked about for decades, frankly, but we're not quite there yet. We have different standards, different styles, different methodologies. There's no doubt about it. The customer would love for us all to be able to talk to each other, but in order to be a little bit different, we do things differently. So coming back to, in a way, the responsibility of the CRA itself, how are they going to make us, sort of comply with what we need to do and when we need to do it? You talked about this really long document on the way back from Amsterdam and things like that. So companies, it's going to be all different types of companies are going to need to adhere. So how do you think it's actually going to work in reality, that all these companies are told and then can work together to make sure that the studio, the OB, whatever live event they're covering is actually going to work?
Well, I think, as you talk interoperability, at the end of the day, we all need to speak the same language, because if we're not speaking the same language, it's going to be hard for us to fully translate that to the end customer, right? So we have to be able to talk the same type of language of what the needs are, and agree that we're all going to deliver this type of data in a similar format to our customers, because it's going to be a requirement. So the law mandates that manufacturers have to track and have a SBOM, software BOM. So that's all the different software components within their system. And as we said, a lot of these systems have OEMs and subcontractors that have chips or processors with software on them that will also need to be tracked. So creating a standard way for them to kind of track and communicate that SBOM, as it's termed, as well as some of the assessments that get done through that process. It's going to be critical that we all come together and agree that this is how we're going to communicate it, not just from us to the customer, but also from us to other vendors, because that's the new wrinkle, is that it's not just, I don't have to just tell my customer about this. I actually have to tell all of the other devices that my product is embedded in, which ends up flowing to the customer at the end of the day. But if we all maintain our own systems, our own databases, we all call it different things, which is very common, it's really just going to be a mess and cost a lot of money for each company to do that. But if we can all come together, our vision at Beam is that essentially if we all come together, standardize information, and share it in the right way, everyone ends up better. We all spend less money. And so that's ultimately the goal, is trying to allow us to come together so the entire industry can operate more efficiently. And ultimately, if the industry can operate more efficiently, we can be more competitive with other industries or other newer technology, because we need to continue investing in innovation, not investing in operational processes to follow a EU mandate. And so that's the burden we're trying to relieve from our industry.
Yeah, it's like transparent compliance almost, but that's going to be a tricky kind of message and discussion, I think, basically, to try and get that across, because obviously people, they do want to maintain their independence and their specialist skill sets and their products as well. But I think you've mentioned software a lot in the SBOM. I think there's a real thinking that this is hardware only, because it's all about networking and getting to the power, basically, and that's where potentially the cybersecurity threats can come from. But actually, it's not just hardware, it's all the stuff that actually goes out of the hardware, and that's where it's going to affect us all personally as well as professionally.
Correct.
So all different sizes of companies are going to be impacted, small right the way up to the really, really superpowers, as it were, of any industry. So if they don't have compliance teams within their organization, this must be dreadful, really. And this is quite terrifying for some of the smaller companies who have a really, really niche product and who do it really well, but do rely on other people to make this niche product. So how on earth is somebody like that meant to comply and make sure that customers are still okay buying their products?
Well, there's probably going to be a bunch of consultants out there that try to make a lot of money saying we'll come in and help
Yeah.
you standardize it.
Whole new industry.
Right. So that's probably what's going to bubble up from some of this. But the challenge is I think some of those smaller companies and even some of the bigger ones that don't build a process are just going to be at a higher risk, right? So they're going to have a higher risk of compliance or getting a fine for one of these things if they don't follow that exact process. So for them, they really do need a tool that they can utilize that's efficient, that's low cost, and that's streamlined, that allows them to stay compliant without having to upend their entire operations. So what we're looking at is how can we, in the most delicate way and with the least touch points possible, allow compliance throughout the build and the update process of these network devices or these devices that are containing software and networked, to not have an impact on those operations. Now, it's a very challenging problem to solve and delicate. It's easy to say, as most companies will probably do, is let's build 50 spreadsheets, let's have stuff here, let's do stuff here. Every single company in the industry is going to have their own version of a CRA management tool, right? Some are going to be spreadsheets, some are going to be Asana boards or Airtable, some of them are going to be a software tool they built, but that's going to be a tremendous amount of man hours, human capital time to not just build those systems, but also to continue maintaining them. So it's going to put a cost burden on the industry, ultimately raising cost of products, and that's where we want to come in. Not just Beam Dynamics ourselves, but really look at how can we be a part in a value add to the industry to help streamline this, whether it's us or some other type of tool or process. But essentially, since we deal with so many manufacturers, this is a major problem that we want to bring more awareness and discussion around, or else both small and big are going to incur a lot of cost and challenges that we feel that there is a way to prevent. But 2027 is just around the corner. They may push the regulation back.
Away. No.
They may not. There's some windows of when you can comply, but it's pretty fuzzy, and it is coming. That's the moral of the story. It is coming. So we need to start preparing now.
Yes, I think if nothing else, just understand what the basic requirements are and then sort of can build on from that. But that's what this is all about, really, starting a discussion on actually what it is and what it means, rather than actually what we can do about it. Right now, I think we're still in the sort of discussion of what this means for us, rather than actually this is the cure and this is the golden way we can actually all do it.
Exactly, and that's kind of where we want to be a part of that and foster that discussion, because we don't have all the answers, right? We're not lawyers, we're not the ones writing the law. We'd like to start to have conversations with those people and understand, right? Beam itself is not a manufacturer. We support them, but we feel that there needs to be a common space that people can come to. And so I think through this, over the next couple of months and years to come, starting to answer these questions that we have open. So what does that mean for me as a maker of this particular device? What does this mean for me that has subcomponents? We have some inklings of these. We've started some initial discovery, but we need some more people helping us to look at what does the letter of the law say? Some more use cases and examples of how this actually needs to be implemented and done. Because right now there is no common understanding of that. It's pretty broad and far-reaching, and since our industry is at a pretty critical inflection point with a lot of changes, we can't let things like this continue to put more pressure on our industry.
More pressure,
right?
You don't need more pressure, right?
Exactly.
So talking about the more pressure, people are trying to actually stretch the life cycle of their products, sort of as much as we want them all to buy lots of, the latest gadgets. There is a real movement, especially with live events and things like that. We're actually going to try and really stretch what we've got and really push that to the max. So, so obviously the CRA is all about, networking and all the rest of it, and the cybersecurity. So what about the people who sort of say, well, but I've had this camera for 20 years, or I've had this, whatever it might be. So I don't need to worry about that, right? This is a while ago. This is stuff that's coming in. This is for all the new world and the IP world. I'm assuming that's not the case.
Correct. So there are some terminology that it will go back a set number of years based on different types of technology deployed. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a requirement. So what the mandate now provides is that manufacturers are required to basically notify end users of changes, potential security risks, as well as security related firmware updates, and make those available to all customers, not just for new products that are sold, but also for historical products that have been sold. And really what this does is it puts immense risk on whoever owns that device for potentially being infiltrated by one of these security breaches, because once someone knows that particular device can be tied into and they can start to control it or get through the network, that means that everyone that has that is at risk. And since now these risks are going to be of a more public nature, right now a manufacturer may have a security breach, not well communicated, but you know what? Also someone that's trying to hack the system also doesn't understand that as well. Now, since it's going to be public knowledge, it's good for us as a public to understand that we're at risk, but it also is going to open up that knowledge to anyone, that all of the potential devices. So if you aren't enacting these updates and security patches, you may actually be at an even higher risk, because now the entire world is going to know where the risks are, as opposed to maybe more of a siloed, hey, it's in our organization, we know, we're going to communicate it, very softly to our customers. So I think that's going to actually increase the likelihood that these devices have a security breach. And I think as a result of that, the IT teams and security teams at these organizations are going to have to hold this a lot tighter, which is a new challenge for them. And they're going to want to ensure that the vendors they buy from are in compliance, that the vendors they buy from have it well documented, well communicated. And I think it's actually going to affect who's buying those products as well, because now your security team is going to come in and say, well, this vendor is more streamlined, they've got a better process. This puts our business at less of a risk, because one cyber attack can cost some of these organizations hundreds of millions of dollars or more. And so I think the IT teams and security teams are going to be more involved in buying decisions than they ever have. And this will be a criteria, another checkbox that they can either decide to proceed or not proceed with you.
It is interesting, as in who's responsible for this, kind of like which end of the kind of like chain. Is it, us as the buyer who needs to ask the question, or is it, the manufacturer, or in broadcast and everything else, the customer? That is an interesting, slight interesting dilemma. And then I'm sure there's going to be some finger pointing that goes on, over the next couple of months as to who needs to start it and who's really going to be responsible. So I suppose one of the, and we have touched on it, but there are some quite devastating things that will happen if you don't comply, which again leads on to who's ultimately going to be responsible. So if there was kind of like one takeaway that you would like to give at the end of podcast 1 on this topic, which I know that we're going to carry on discussing with lots of different people, and I'm quite excited about the various different ways we're going to be exploring this. But for the first one and everything else, what would you say is the kind of like, the takeaway that you'd want people to know?
So the CRA is going to affect every manufacturer or industry that has a device that could be connected to a network. And that is virtually every single manufacturer in our industry. It's going to put challenges on how they operate, from not just product management, but even customer communication. And they're going to have to find new ways to do things. And if we don't start now, there's no way that in 2027 manufacturers are going to be fully prepared. And so I think the one sentence takeaway is that you need to start thinking about this today. And if you don't, you are just putting yourself more at risk every day that you're not thinking about this problem and trying to find this solution.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. This has been genuinely fascinating. And thank you so much for your time. And episode 2 will be coming along shortly. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jennie.
David.
Yes.